ESG, environment, social and governance, is on everyone's lips at the moment. In the autumn, we had a partner dinner where we asked where disability fits into the ESG agenda. And the short answer is everywhere. So we wanted to continue the conversation on a global level today, and that's why I'm delighted to be speaking to John McCalla-Leacy, who is Global Head of ESG at KPMG. And John and I will be talking about the role of leadership in the global ESG agenda, and specifically how to affect transformational change in this ever-changing world, that's an understatement, for disabled people. Lovely to see you, John. Thank you for joining me.
And likewise, always great to see you, Diane, and thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for taking the time in your incredibly busy schedule. I think you're just back from COP27, but we'll come on to that a bit later on. So John, as I mentioned, you are head of Global ESG at KPMG. What does it mean to be a leader in this space and at this time?
Well, brilliant question to start off with. It's incredibly difficult. It's challenging. And just to summarize, leaders right now are facing the three C's of challenges, which is climate, cost of living, and also conflict. And what they're seeking to do is they're having to navigate, on one hand, transforming their businesses to ones which are sustainable and low carbon businesses, but also in the short term having to deal with the impact of inflation on the employees, their staff, their customer base. So leaders are often finding that they're having to make some very tough decisions right now. So it's pretty challenging.
Yes, and again, I think that's an understatement. And I think you could still add a fourth C to your list with COVID, which is still kind of lingering on amongst us. So ESG reporting itself is suddenly very much in the spotlight. At our global dinner, we were asking, is this the new CSR? What does this actually mean? How can it be used as a force for good? So what are some of the challenges you are seeing, and how do you think ESG reporting can actually be used effectively in business?
Well, in terms of the challenges, and it connects a lot, doesn't it, to your first question. Business leaders, I speak a lot to CEOs, and they see that there's a huge push for more reporting, for more transparency, and there's a lot. If you are leading a global company, you've got different reporting standards from right across the world. And right now, we've recently completed a survey, and we found that of the 250 largest companies in the whole world, some 96% of them are now reporting on ESG and sustainability. So in terms of what that means and the opportunities that we see through this is that businesses can actually go beyond box ticking, go beyond simply complying to these various different reporting requirements. And if they really choose to embrace ESG, which, at its heart through reporting is what they're seeking to have is much more transparency. Much more transparency around what businesses are doing in the E from an environmental perspective, but also from an S perspective, considering societal areas such as diversity, inclusion, human rights. In their businesses, in terms of the countries in which they operate, which includes countries right across the globe and throughout their supply chain. So what we see is that when businesses are happy to step forward and embrace this reporting and go beyond purely compliance, to really thinking about what strategically, what the strategic benefits they have to having more transparency, more sustainable workforce and more sustainable practices. They see that it's driving a different conversation, a conversation that's that's going from the boardroom right down and throughout the organisation, and it's driving transformational change to what I believe is the goal that we all want to get to, which is from compliance through strategic change to purpose-led and sustainable businesses.
I love that. I love the beyond compliance piece. And of course, unfortunately, there are countries in the world where disability is very much a human rights issue, but it's also very much a talent issue and a consumer issue. And one of the things that has struck me since I've been at BDF, which is almost 6 years, is just how much good practice and genuine commitment to getting it right there is in a lot of large global private sector businesses, which is really, really encouraging to see. But I think it can, ESG, to be slightly provocative, it can sound boring. And it's bringing it to life, isn't it? That narrative. And I remember when we were chatting before, John, you were saying about how to tell that story in a compelling way. So what are some of the things are you seeing, and do you have advice around that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because it can just seem like this big construct, and which is really unclear as to what it absolutely means. And I think with all storytelling, it's important to put your heart right in the centre of it, to make it really personal in terms of telling the story. So let's talk about the E, as it were. So we're all struggling right now with the energy crisis that we see. And we know that the energy crisis would not be as deep, it would not be as prevalent right now if only us as leaders took decisions in the past to invest in energy efficiency so as to reduce the demand that we have right now, or to invest in the renewables so as to increase the security of supply. So when you talk about that in a very simple way, and you talk about it in terms of what it means for us as individuals. So for myself, as you can see, I'm in my home office right now. I'm in the loft. I spend a lot of time myself, layering my insulation. So I talk about that in a very, very personal way. And then considering the S, the S is so critically important, talking about inclusion, diversity and equity, talking about this in a way which opens up and reveals some of yourself as a leader. So I'm from a Jamaican heritage. I often share about my parents coming to the UK in the 60s from Jamaica. It was very cold there. It was a cold time, but often it was cold in terms of being quite hostile to them, and what that meant for them in terms of how they lived at that time through the 60s right to modern day right now. I talk about my own struggle with disability. I have an unseen disability. People are often quite shocked about this because they think, what is it? And I like to leave it a little bit out there so that they ask the questions, and then you're engaging, and then you're talking. And when you're talking about something in a way which is really relatable and really personal, and that's when you can connect with people on a completely different level.
Totally. Those personal stories are so powerful. And as you're saying about having a disability that's not immediately visible, well, that's true of 90%, over 90% of disabilities, but so many people still don't realise that. I think what you're just saying about investing as well and acting in advance is really important. I'm just thinking of that expression, I'm going to get it wrong, but the best time to plant an oak tree is 100 years ago, but the second best time is now.
Yes.
So making sure that we don't just say, oh, it's all too late and we're too reliant on carbon, or we're too reliant on whatever. We can still all individually and collectively make a change.
Absolutely. The time is always right to do the right thing. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we also talk quite a lot around how E and S, and I'm guessing G, are not separate. So one of the messages that we've tried to get across, we had a report earlier this year about built environment, which is if you are thinking about your carbon footprint and your built environment from an environmental point of view, also think about accessibility at the same time. Take that opportunity to do both rather than rather than making it an either or, because disabled people are equally, in some cases more, affected by climate change. So
couldn't agree.
we do this. So on to climate.
Yes.
You've just returned from COP27 in Egypt.
Good.
So what have you been saying to senior leaders about ESG and specifically about disability?
Yeah, no, that's great. So if I set context a little bit first, so I was incredibly fortunate in going to COP26 and have, as you said, just returned from COP27. Now, COP26 for me was the COP of commitment. So we saw going into Glasgow, there was approximately 30% of global GDP covered by net zero or net zero related goals, so 30%. And it was at the time coming out of COVID, whereby, we weren't quite sure, well, was it going to happen? Would it be remote? Will leaders turn up? And it had this really low number of 30%. Now, coming out of Glasgow, that 30% went right up to 90% of global GDP commitments. So that's fantastic. So COP26 was really seen as the COP of commitment. Now, COP27 was really framed as, taking that commitment and driving action, because it's very, very clear we are not, I repeat, we are not on track for 1.5 degrees. And what we need to do is to take those words, take those distant off targets and drive them into action right now. But what's so important, and this is what I want to touch on now as regards to disability, for COP27, not only do we need to focus on action, but we need to make sure that it is just, it is fair, and it is equitable. And one of the big issues that we've seen through all of the COPs, all of them, you can go back to the very start, is there been a lack of diversity in terms of the voices around the table who are contributing to the debate, who are contributing to the action plans. Now, for COP27, we've seen more progress in this space. And the reason why I say that is that there was a notable increase in the numbers of people who are, persons with disabilities who are actually attending COP27, which is great. We saw a noticeable increase in the numbers of discussions and debates. It's really frantic when you're on the ground there, Diane. There's lots of negotiation rooms. Yeah, so it's a lot to take in. So there was an increase there also. And one of the things I would say is that there was also actionable, so specific language on disability, which was adopted by this COP, which is really encouraging. This is in the action on climate empowerment, which would see the inclusion of more communication, more information, more education with the public and public participation through people with disabilities. So what I would say is, as we move from commitment to action, I've seen some green shoots of hope in terms of some more dialogue, but it's not enough. And what we need to do is we need to hold leaders to account in ensuring that that commitment grows as we move forwards.
I really like that there's that focus on specific language around disability and making sure that people with disabilities are equally engaged and can play their part in solving this, because it's going to have to be absolutely everyone that does it. And as you were talking, I was about the lack of diversity of people in the room around the table. I was thinking of the importance of inclusive design and a couple of important but kind of micro examples. I'm thinking of the banning of plastic straws, for example, for very, very good reasons, but some people with disabilities rely on them to eat and drink. And possibly more dramatically, not sure, electric vehicles that don't make a noise, great for not having sound pollution, not so great if you have a visual impairment and can't actually hear them coming. So there's been some really interesting and very important learning around making sure that we get everybody's lived experience in the room when we're making these big and actually micro decisions as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. And what we'll see is this immersion or this continuous, this whole construct called just transition, ensuring that the transition is just for all, and it will simply not happen unless we have those voices around the table. Interestingly enough, I was involved in COP in a discussion and a panel, and in this debate we touched on exactly the plastic straws piece and saying, well, we cannot allow things like this to happen. So we need to challenge ourselves. When we start a meeting, when everybody goes around the table, when we introduce ourselves, even before starting a meeting, we should be considering who's invited, what is the debate, do we have proper representation, and if not, let's make sure we make changes appropriately. So, but we need to keep an eye on this. As I said, there are green shoots, but we're not there yet. We need to keep pushing forwards.
Totally. I like a just transition. And of course, we will only know we're making progress if we manage to measure. And this is probably not a sweeping generalisation to say that senior leaders are usually very interested in numbers and collecting data. So from your point of view, why is that important? And also, how do leaders address pushback from people with disabilities who say, why should we tell you, and what are you going to do with that information?
Yeah, I hear this a lot, and look, in summary, Diane, how I would position this is that we know that in the world of business, what gets measured gets managed, and unless we're able to measure, we cannot show progress. And actually, what it means from a leadership perspective is leaders are not being held accountable. We need transparency. With transparency, as I mentioned, becomes trust, but also with that comes accountability. And when we have these discussions and when we have the pushback, I really believe that it's incredibly important for leaders to engage directly with members of the disability community and directly with them in hearing their concerns. One of the things I talk about a lot, it really drives me personally, is there's power in proximity. And taking that time to be close, taking that time to hear their concerns, and also to share, what it is that we're trying to achieve, and actually say, well, look, this is what we're trying to do, but we want your help on this. We need your help. We need to measure this because, quite frankly, in business, we're not doing very well. It's not good enough. The rate to which we have capitalized on the huge array of talent that we have available to us is quite frankly quite disappointing. We've recruited, we've promoted from a very, very small and narrow window of talent, and this is where we have to change, and we have to change quickly. So it's having that discussion, it's having that debate, it's saying to people, please, hold me accountable on this. This is what I want you to do, and I want you to talk to me. And if we're not progressing to the pace that we should be, you should be asking me why, and we should be moving forward together to make change happen faster. So it's that dialogue that is incredibly important.
That transparency and authenticity that I know that you talk so eloquently about. I love power in proximity. In some respects, I'm guessing it's got easier doing things remotely because you can actually connect directly with people, although of course it is through a screen. So I know, John, that we're nearly out of time. I could talk to you for hours. You're so eloquent on this. So I guess any kind of final thoughts that you would like to share to global leaders listening to this about what they can do to be a transformational leader in this space?
Well, just continuing on from that power in proximity, I believe really strongly, Diane, that we need to focus on driving, on role modeling a form of ethical leadership, which has a fundamental belief in the dignity and the rights of others at its heart. And through that, and if we just think and reflect for a second as leaders, if we really had that at our heart in every dialogue, in every communication that we ever shared, what that would mean in shaping our engagement with our staff and with our customers and our suppliers. I also believe, in addition to the ethical leadership, that we need to be humble. as leaders, humility is so important. We're all on a journey, we're all learning. We touched on the 3 C's or the 4th C that you mentioned, Diane, before with COVID, that we're in very, very challenging times. And as leaders, we need to listen, we need to learn, and we need to be prepared to actually say, well, you know what, we've made a mistake, you know, we will do things differently. And the third and final thing for me is about being courageous as leaders. It's about being prepared, if necessary, to stand alone in doing what's right over the long term. So for us at KPMG, and I know we've talked about this before, Diane, we've been very, very transparent in setting targets for representation. So we've got a target of 15%, and we challenged ourselves in this, and we decided we're going to be courageous. That target shouldn't just be across the whole of the organization, but specifically in senior leadership. So this means that, you know, when we look at the organization, when we look at representation of persons with disabilities, we're looking at the partners, the directors, and the senior leaders in our organization, and we're ensuring that we are being bold, being courageous in doing all that we can to drive, you know, proper diversity and proper inclusion across our firm. So what I would say is ethical leadership with humility, but with courage at its heart, is incredibly important.
Thank you, John. I think you've beautifully just illustrated the importance of role modelling. And if ever there was a short masterclass on ethical, inclusive and humble leadership, I think you've just given it. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute honour to talk with you. And I sincerely hope this won't be the last of our conversations in this, because I would love to pick your brain some more around the measurement and how we really drive this agenda forward inclusively and have, as you say, a just transition. So huge thanks to John McCalla-Leacy for joining me, and back to our global conference.